teachers grapple with. And particularly white teachers, but in some ways that all teachers grapple with, understanding and being able to work with these things. Learning how to see and address institutional barriers, learning how to recognize institutionalized inequities as they play out in everyday life as well as in our own backgrounds, learning to see ourselves as cultural beings so that we can recognize the cultures that people around us have. And what I hear a lot from white teachers is, I don't have culture. In fact, that's what led to the title of this book, White Bread. It's a term that I've heard in class a number of times. Just a quick definition of how I see whiteness. I see it in terms of three pieces. One is a set of institutionalized social relationships of power. Second is an identity when people of European descent just sort of take for granted those institutionalized relationships. And then we'll define, like in the US, define American as being white, or white as being American. And then just not think about that. And third is an ideology that renders all of this invisible to white people. People of color can usually see most of it, but for white people, can't. So a lot of my work over the last 30-something years has been working with teachers, in some cases predominantly white groups, in other cases very diverse groups, but to try to unpack these issues and make them visible, because I believe that we can't really transform schooling if we can't see what it is that needs to be transformed, and if we can't see what we bring to the situation. There are people who write about the crisis of white identity. These are some quotes by various theorists over the years. But the problem seems to arise, and this is, for me, I've experienced quite a bit as a teacher-educator, as those of us who are white like to think of ourselves as good people. But if we don't understand racism, especially how institutionalized racism works and our own participation in that, then somebody like me, the teacher, or some of your other teachers, try to put on the table, okay, we're going to study this stuff. Then what a lot of white people will do is take that and say, oh, you're saying I'm racist. You're saying I'm a bad person. And that sort of shuts down wanting to learn. And so that leaves white people with what some theorists have called the crisis of white cultural identity. This last quotation here by Taub, I also found out of the New York Times article, important because as I look at the rise of Trump and the post-election and how racism has played a part in that, in relationship to some of this stuff, the struggle for white identity is not just a political problem, it's about a deep story of feeling stuck while others move forward. About a week ago, I was having a conversation with a friend who's white and who grew up in a poor area of Pennsylvania. And she said, you know, when I go back to Pennsylvania, what I hear from a lot of white folks is they're feeling like they're not going anywhere with their jobs. And then they'll see an immigrant with a gardening truck, and they'll go, where did he get that truck? Why does he have a truck and I don't have the truck? And I'm like, what? And to me, what that shows is a lot of not really understanding ourselves historically as well as currently what's going on. I love these two quotes. Adrienne Rich said, in America we have only the present tense. And William Faulkner, the past isn't dead. It's never dead. It isn't even past. So the past continues to live in what happens every day. But most of us have such a terrible historical consciousness that we don't know how to interpret today in light of the past. And a lot of us, the way we experience the teaching of history actually doesn't help. I think back to when I took history classes, and they really put me to sleep. And it was about all of this stuff way back when that didn't really have anything to do with today. So somebody would say history and my eyes would glaze over. The same thing has happened with a lot of my teacher ed students. Oh, yeah, and so then we have Secretary DeVos. Just the other day saying something that's like, oh my God. Oh, talking about historically black colleges and universities. You guys, you're aware of this?
Yeah.
Yeah, as being pioneers of choice. Like, because she did not seem to be aware of the fact that the African American system of education got created when African Americans were barred by white people from going to white people's universities. And so that just like that totally missed her, like pioneers of choice. So this is a really good example of taking something in the present and then shoving it into your own framework because you don't understand history. That happens a lot. Forgetting is socially organized. This quote from some of B. Pecauer's work, it replicates what I've seen in a lot of my own classes. I have periodically tried doing family history projects in my classes, and then I kind of stopped doing them for a while because I wasn't sure how to get beyond the pull yourself up by your bootstraps that I would see, particularly in the white students' stories. And I'm sitting there thinking, okay, now let's see. The students of color are writing about how their families navigated racism. The white students are writing about how they pulled themselves up by their bootstraps. Who is perpetrating the racism that the families of color were navigating? If it wasn't, the ancestors of the white people in the room who were busy pulling themselves up by their bootstraps. This similar thing was said to me several years ago by a teacher I was working with. She was teaching in a school where a large number of the students were African American. And so then she would get really critical about the students' families in relationship to how she understood her own Italian ancestors' background. Well, they worked hard, so why can't these folks work hard? So there's a lot that gets forgotten in the history that we remember. And in this quotation by Jacobson in Roots 2, where he's talking about the persistent forgetting of the violence that it took to create this society and the racialized violence that those of us who are white, our ancestors, were a part of. Toni Morrison makes a similar observation in an interview with Paul Gilroy a number of years ago. But this culture doesn't encourage dwelling on, let alone coming to terms with, the truth about the past. And that memory is much more in danger now than it was 30 years ago. Ta-Nehisi quotes also, it says something very similar in his book, Between the World and Me, of the persistent forgetting, and particularly on the part of what he calls the people of the dream, or white people who have this dream that's really not reality, because it involves blocking out so much. And he asks, or says, that the new people were something else before they were white. And if our national hopes have any fulfillment, then they'll have to be something else again, which means trying to shatter what that whiteness is, or at least look at it. So what the novel tries to do is to personalize and try to draw the reader into a process that somebody fictionalized, but based on a lot of teachers I've worked with, goes through, and there's also sort of a lot of me in there, goes through in transforming how they see the world. I'm going to do a little bit of reading from the book and talking more specifically about the book in a few minutes, but I want to do just a little bit more framing here. Family history is something that people actually study. I didn't actually know that there was a body of work studying family history until just a couple of years ago when I started reading about it. But there's some themes that come through in research that's been done on how people do family history. And one of those themes is that most of us concentrate mostly on fleshing out the ancestors, and we don't pay too much attention to the broader context. Eric Gardner is African-American genealogist who has a really interesting article about waves of family history research, where he talks about a first wave being where people were trying to document, white people were trying to document their status in society by tracing themselves back to, you descend from the Queen of England or something like that. A second wave, which came about when Alex Haley published his book Roots, was more ordinary people trying to find out just who the ancestors were and what the story was. And after Alex Haley's book and then the TV serial based on it, then a lot of people who didn't necessarily trace back to famous people and weren't trying to show their status just wanted to find out what the stories were. But in a lot of that, what's missing, and what he calls the third wave, is trying to take an understanding of the past to analyze and deal with and transform current social issues. And so when I read his article, I'm like, yeah, that's where I'm trying to go with the work that I'm doing. Parham did a real interesting study of how black and white genealogists approach family history differently. He was in New Orleans, looking at Dominican family historians, and just sort of followed them around while they were gathering data and trying to make sense out of it. And by and large, the white family historians, and he particularly wanted to know how they dealt with the slavery and racial oppression in Dominican history. So the white family genealogists would flush out the family tree and then use the social context as sort of this backdrop. For the black genealogists, the social context was part of the story. So how the family navigated and worked with racism wasn't just a backdrop, it was part of the story. Darby and Chloe, there's other people who have looked at family history, but they were looking at how family historians approach collecting data. Through their interviews, noticed that only about 20% of the family historians they interviewed looked at the broader context. Most were just focused on fleshing out the family tree. Family tree templates, most of them are just the family tree. They don't ask about the broader context. And even TV shows like Henry Louis Gates, and I really like his show, but he also doesn't really link the issues around racism today with the histories of, at least I haven't seen him do that on the show. He sort of emphasizes how we're all connected, which I think is great, but he could do a lot more with trying to open up social issues and how our ancestors have been a part of the construction of current social issues, and I don't think he does that. So just one more of the theoretical quotes, and then I'll get into more specifics about the book. This was from a kind of a thin book by Annette Kuhn, where she's looking at how people make sense of family photos and ask the question of what gets forgotten and what stories get told when we look at family photos. And again, she's talking about family history as memory work, is trying to dig into those memories that have been forgotten, that are part of broader public memories, the broader public stories, and where the public and the private sort of come together. So this all these ideas led me to what I have now called critical family history. I started doing this work probably about 10 or 12 years ago when I had some time to just do some research on my own ancestry, because I didn't know beyond my grandparents. I didn't know anything. I only had a few names, and that was about it. And I had also learned to pull themselves up by the bootstraps story. So I first wanted to find out. I first wanted to flesh out the family tree. But then, being somebody who's worked in multicultural education, social justice for years, I started then applying questions to what I was finding about, well, how did racism work at particular points in time where my family was, and how was my family embedded within race relations? How did the social class structure work? Who was my family culturally? And the kinds of questions that I ask in my multicultural education classes. So critical family history, I basically define as locating your family within historical context that are shaped by membership in sociocultural groups and conflict over power and resources. There's a lot that's embedded in there, but I'm using the tools from critical theory, critical race theory, critical whiteness studies, critical feminist theory. And if any of you are interested, some of this I'm just sort of running over kind of like fast, are interested in looking more at where I'm going with these concepts besides what I talk about today. On my website, which is really easy to find, if you just Christine Sleeter, Google, then it'll come up. Then I have a whole blog site on critical family history. And the file that's critical-family-history outlines more what critical family history is. And then you can kind of take off from there. But as I was doing, so the research process is essentially a two-part process. And when I'm working with critical family history, I kind of go back and forth between these two processes. Doing genealogy research, that everybody does when they're doing family history. How many of you have done family history? Okay, quite a few of you. Then doing the contextual research. And for the contextual research, I developed this guideline that basically asks the question, for any given family unit, during a particular decade, in a particular location, who else was around? And what were the relationships among groups? Or who else could have been around that was excluded, and why? And how did the process of exclusion work? And that starts opening up a bunch of questions that family historians usually don't open up. And that's what Whitebread starts to try to show where you can go when you open up those questions. I use things like primary accounts that were written at the time, and you'll see some of that in examples from Whitebread, demographic census data, and other histories to try to elaborate on that larger social context. So, so why did I decide to write fiction? And what does Whitebread deal with? Well, I mentioned that I've been doing this research on my own family history for about 12 years or so. And as I would get invited to speak various places, I started trying out what I was learning. And I realized in the context of doing that, I started to see what some deeper themes were in what I was finding out. At first it was kind of a smattering of stuff, and then I started to be able to see some big stories there. One of the stories, and this is a story that Whitebread really focuses on a lot, not exclusively, but a lot, is the loss of culture, language, and historical memory that actually a lot of us in this country experience. And a lot of times I think those of us who are white don't necessarily think about what we've lost. But I started to ask myself, actually back when I was a kid, on my father's side of the family, they're all descendants of German immigrants. My mother's side of the family is much more diverse, and it's forming the basis for the second novel. I'm working on the second novel, but for this one, so as a kid I started wondering, why didn't we grow up learning German? Not instead of English, but in addition to English. What happened to German? My grandmother, I didn't realize until I was doing this research, grew up as a kid in a German and English-speaking household. So what happened to German? Where did it go? I ended up taking a lot of German in school and at the university, but didn't learn any of it through the family. And what happened? Why didn't I know where my name came from? Sleeter, I know, is anglicized German. What was the German? So we used to ask my mom that. My dad died when I was a kid. His dad died before I was ever born. Both of them heart attacks. So, and she said, well, I don't know, it's anglicized German, something, I don't know. So I didn't know what the roots of my own name until just a few years ago when I visited a place that I'll show you a picture of, a church in Booty, Illinois, which was Sleeter. And like, wow, that's the name that the ancestors brought. Why does this stuff matter? Well, I think it does matter for a couple of reasons, at least a couple of reasons. One is that those of us who grow up speaking English, which is a whole lot of us in this country, seem to believe that learning another language is so hard. Why should we have to do it when a lot of the world speaks English? So can't the rest of the world just? We don't grow up bilingual because we've snuffed out a lot of bilingualism that has existed in this country. And when I realized that I have a large part of my ancestry that was bilingual and bicultural, and of German, actually, German is the largest ancestry in the United States. So there are a lot of us who have lost histories of bilingualism and biculturalism. And so then we'll think that it's too hard, not necessary, but we've lost something. We also, many of us aren't aware of the violence that our ancestors endured that was a part of losing that heritage. And so I'll show you a little bit of that violence, and hopefully have time to read a section where I try to put one of my ancestors into how she would have experienced that violence on herself. It's not the same violence that people of African descent have experienced. It's not the same violence that people of color generally have experienced. But we do have, many of us, legacies of violence and pain that have been suppressed, that we've lost, and that we don't have available to tap into. There's also a flip side of being white, and that is, how do we benefit from privileges? There's some of that in White Bread. The book that I'm working on right now is a teacher, a white teacher, who's coming to terms with the fact that the house she has, she can trace it to theft of Indian land. And when you deal with the fact that you're a descendant of the colonizers who benefited from colonization, where do you go with that? So that's the next book, that's not this one. So why fiction? Well, it's fun to write, but I started looking at how fiction gets used in teacher education and how teachers are portrayed in fiction. And oftentimes in teacher education, we'll use fiction as a way of trying to help teachers stand in somebody else's shoes and see the world through somebody else's viewpoint. We don't necessarily use fiction, at least I haven't seen people do it, to have teachers reflect back upon themselves. Partly because most of the protagonists in fiction are not teachers. How many of you can think of a good book you've read where the teacher was the main protagonist? No hands. Well, I mean, but usually when teachers are protagonists, they're in elite schools in England, this was kind of interesting. A study that somebody did of the portrayal of teachers in children's literature. So 74 books, that's way more than I thought were there, but most of them were overwhelmingly white women who teach because they love children, and they're controlled mainly by male principals who don't rock the boat. So if I'm thinking about helping teachers become activists, this is not, that's not where I want to go. So I started asking myself, well, okay, what does it look like when an early career, actually any teacher, but in my case, since I'm trying to unpack whiteness, it's a white teacher, I'm not trying to center whiteness, but I'm trying to unpack it, becomes aware of white privilege in their own background, becomes aware of the violent suppression of their own family's history, begins to experiment with culturally responsive teaching. So you could actually see that classroom scenes in the book. Begins to see why ethnic studies make sense, and then becomes an activist ally. What might that process look like? So this becomes what White Bread deals with. The storyline alternates between past and present. When I started doing the family history research, I had all this data, and to try to share it with people, sharing like lists of data is really boring. So I started gradually trying to write it up as stories. But the stories by themselves, it's like, okay, now where do I go with this? And I wanted to connect the stories with the present, but I didn't want to write about me and my siblings and people who are now alive. Some colleagues suggested, do a memoir. And I don't really want to do that. So one day when I was out walking the dog, which is where I get some of my best ideas actually, it came to me, I will use the data from the past and the stories that I've been creating and do more with making those stories more interesting. And I'll fictionalize the present. But I want linkages between past and present to come through. So that's what I did. So the stories in the past are two families in the Midwest. One of the families, Mary, Heinrich, and family. This is Mary. Obviously, this would be Heinrich. This is my grandmother. So these would be my great-grandparents. He was a preacher from, he immigrated to the U.S. from a tiny little village, Volkerode, in Germany, when he was about 17 or so. And he then finished his schooling, then went to seminary to become a bilingual German Methodist Episcopal minister. And there were 2 seminaries at the time, but he went through one of them. The other family is Willie and Lydia, and I don't have pictures of them, but I do have pictures of the church that Willie's father co-founded in this little town, Moody, Illinois, which is near Decatur. And this is what it looked like when I visited a few years ago, and that's where I found out that Sleeter was actually an anglicized version of Sleeter, because the records were all kept in German initially. So those are the 2 stories. So I'm going to do a little bit of reading here. The book opens with a teaching problem that the protagonist, whose name is Jessica, is having. She's teaching in a school where about half the students are Mexican American and about half the students are white. She doesn't understand the students very well, and she's struggling with just some basic, just a lot of stuff that beginning teachers struggle with. She goes home one day sort of frustrated and happens to be going through a box of stuff that had belonged to her mother, these old family records. And in the box, as she's plowing through it, she finds a letter that was written by somebody in 1928 who was named Mary to her sister, apparently, who was named Annie. And she's like, who are these people? And so she's like, this has got to have something to do with us. Her mother had passed away, her dad has died, and so she can't go and ask them. And so she takes the letter to school, and one of her friends said, well, you could research that. So through the book, as she starts doing the research, readers of the book, if they haven't done family history, learn some family history search tools that's kind of built in as a part of the book. And as she starts doing the research, these people from the past start becoming visible to her. So I'd like to read one of the stories, part of one of the stories, involving Mary. It takes place in Quincy, Illinois, and so it's October 1885. So it just sort of gives you a flavor of a German family in Quincy, Illinois, the wife of a preacher. Mary balanced baby Edward in the crook of one arm as she stepped out onto the broad veranda of the parsonage in Quincy. Slowly inhaling the crisp autumn air, she enjoyed a brief respite from housework before fixing dinner. When she and Heinrich married 9 years ago, she had no idea how often they'd move. Not that it would have stopped her, but frequent moves were difficult, especially with young children. The church authorities assigned novice preachers like Heinrich to rural churches for experience, as they put it. But she suspected the real reason was that no one with seniority wanted to bounce around among churches too small and too scattered to support their own preacher. And by the way, as I was researching this, I mean, this is all based on historical record about how the German churches operated, probably how a lot of churches operated. Mary noticed Frau Gratz approaching from the corner of Jefferson Street, a church member who had immigrated from Germany. She was now in her 50s. Short and stocky, she usually wore black. As Mary was learning, however, her sweet face and ruddy cheeks signaled sturdy health and an agreeable disposition. Mary noticed she was carrying something. Guten Tag, wie geht's? Frau Gratz greeted her. Oh, guten Tag. Come join me and baby Edward. As Frau Gratz waddled up the stairs, Mary recognized a pan of strudel in her hands. I thought you might enjoy something sweet for dessert, she said, proffering the pan. You are too kind, Mary beamed, having heard rave testimonials of Frau Gratz's strudel. Please sit. Can I bring you some tea? Nein, danke. I just had some. Frau Gratz sat down. And how are you adjusting to your new home? Her eyes quickly surveyed the white two-story parsonage, newly built 8 years previously. Oh, we're blessed. We couldn't have hoped for more. Frau Gratz beamed, her husband having served on the church building committee, planning the parsonage. Then she said, my husband was accosted yesterday by some of those English people. They called him a drunken communist. What do you make of that? Mary knew she was referring to harassment of presumed German unionists because of their labor organizing in opposition to prohibition. They were especially active in the Chicago area, where German workers' clubs and churches sponsored lively and highly visible community picnics. Mary replied, "I'm so sorry to hear that. Heinrich says there aren't many people here like that, thank goodness. He says those people seem to think all Germans are socialists. I don't know that I'd agree, although I don't see anything wrong with people organizing to improve their living conditions." "Nor do I. Of course my husband, employed at the German Savings Bank, isn't involved in the unions at all. I'm very sorry to hear he was harassed, but I don't imagine anything will come of it. Most people in Quincy seem reasonable and kind. At least that's what I've experienced in the month that I've been here. Yeah, Quincy's a good place, and the German community will wrap its arms around you. We're so used to newcomers who arrive practically every day." Frau Gratz said, referring to the constant influx of immigrants recruited to work in Quincy's various industries. "Did you know Heinrich completed seminary training here 10 years ago?" Mary asked. "I thought he might have. Where did he immigrate from?" "Volkerode in Hesse-Kassel, 2 years after Prussia annexed it," Mary replied. "Some of his relatives were already just north of here, and so that's where he went. I think some land baron originally recruited Germans. That's how his cousins wound up there. His brothers and his sister arrived shortly after him." "Ah, those Prussians. My family left Sachsen when I was about 15, mainly because no one wanted to serve in Prussia's army. When an immigration party was organized and land made available in America, we signed up. You were born here, yeah? You sound more American when you talk than the immigrants do." "Yes, I was. Right after they got here, my parents met, married, and then along I came." It was true, Mary thought. German immigrants like Frau Gratz and Heinrich never completely lost their accent. And so that's a little bit of a flavor of one of the historical stories that Jessica gradually gets to know, and these people gradually emerge as people, and storylines in their lives gradually emerge. One of the storylines has to do with Willie, who became a county supervisor in Macon County, Illinois. This is her well, we don't know how many greats, but a grandfather. And this particular story emerges while Jessica is in the process of looking into racism in the labor market in the mid-1800s, after the Civil War. And I'm not going to go into how she got into looking at racism in the labor market, why she did that and how she did that, but it is in the book here. But she, after looking into and dealing with the question really of, did newly freed slaves and immigrants have the same opportunity in the labor market? And she discovered, no, they didn't. So she started looking at old newspaper articles. And so I'm going to pick up when she's looking, and she's on the computer, her friend is left, and she's just trying to sort of figure some of this out. Up came the Herald Dispatch for July 1, 1893. Surprised that there actually was something about colored carpenters, Jessica located and read the article in question. So this is from the newspaper article. "What the colored people need more than anything else is an opening in the industrial world. Of the hundreds of domestic service, for instance, there are a number who are capable of learning skilled trades and receiving the larger pay which awaits those who have skilled labor to sell. Why do not more of them learn skilled trades then? Simply put, because they don't have the opportunity, simply because they're not given a chance. The labor unions are almost all against them. In one way or another, nearly all the colored race of our city are directly serving white men. Where do you see the colored carpenter, stair builder, painter, plumber, iron or brass molder?" And this really starts taking on the racism in the labor unions, which is one of the things that she begins to develop some awareness of. The long ago writer continued to list skilled trades from which the labor unions had blocked African Americans. Labor unions consisting of white men. And some of those white men were probably German immigrants. And the German churches churches that abhorred slavery, they didn't appear to have been agitating for post-slavery justice, at least not as far as she knew. For them, community was both sustaining and exclusionary, a way of thinking about community she hadn't considered before. Jessica scanned the rest of the page. She saw a diagram for building a chicken coop, an article about a bank failure in another county, and an article about a grand jury for a lynching case. Schoolwork forgotten, she began to pore through digitized newspapers to figure out how her German ancestors, and especially Willie, who had been licked to the position where he could do something, figured into race relations in Macon County during the latter part of the 1800s. So the story then moves to a young man who was lynched. And I'll read just a little bit of the story itself, which I turned into a story, but didn't have to do a whole lot of imagining because most of this was reported in the local newspaper. And the question that Jessica has to deal with is if her ancestor Willie was on the board of supervisors, and they appoint the grand jury, and they work with issues related to justice in the county. Why didn't he do anything? And what does that mean for her? So here's some of the story. June 1893. Samuel craved water. The June sun blasting down on him since morning showed no sign of relenting, and he still had days to go before reaching his sister's home in Tennessee. Maybe there he'd be safe from pursuit, since robbing that store near the Iowa border. What a stupid thing to do. Gainfully employed as a farmhand, there was no reason to steal. There was only the temptation of an open cash register drawer, while the clerk fetched a box of canned goods from the stockroom. Samuel spied a farmhouse ahead. Maybe they'd give this dusty Negro some water. They might even be persuaded to give him a plate of food, his first and probably only meal of the day. As Samuel approached this two-story farmhouse, which resembled a painting in a hotel where he had worked briefly, he wondered why the air was eerily quiet, not a soul in sight. He knocked on the door. Silence, and then footsteps. A white woman, black hair drawn back into a knot, curiously peered out. "Can I help you?" she said. "Ma'am, I'm traveling to my sister's house and wonder if you can spare me some water," he said. She glared at him. "Just a minute." She shut the door. A few seconds later, she cracked the door open and handed him a dipper. "Well's over there," she pointed. Samuel went to the well, filled the dipper, and drank deeply. Returning it to her, he said, "Thank you, ma'am. You wouldn't have any food to spare a hungry man, would you?" "Get away from me! Get out of here!" she yelled. Instinctively, he touched her arm. "Ma'am, please, I won't harm you. I'm just hungry." "Don't touch me! Help!" she shrieked. "That's all right, ma'am. I'm leaving." He withdrew his hand, backed up, turned, and fled. Samuel scrambled down the road, then dove into a clump of bushes, his heart pumping wildly. In the distance, he heard men's voices and the clip-clop of horses. He remained still as possible as voices approached. "That nigger's around here somewhere," a voice said. "He can't have gone too far. We'll teach him to touch our women," another said. "He'll be sorry he was ever born." Samuel tried to control his trembling as they neared his hideout. They didn't stop, however, but continued on as they discussed where he might be. He stayed in the bushes for what felt like hours. Finally, dusk approached, and he crawled out, then ran as fast as he could. He gradually slowed, then, knowing that a running Negro would look suspicious to passers-by. Presently, he heard the clatter of a horse-drawn wagon behind him. "Can I offer you a ride?" Samuel turned to see a white man about his age. The man's relaxed face suggested he was unaware of Samuel's pursuers. "Where are you staying?" "I'm bound for Tennessee, sir, to stay with my sister," Samuel replied. "Tennessee? You have a long walk ahead of you. Hop in. You're probably hungry. That's my farmhouse just up ahead. Let me give you a little bit of supper, and you can sleep in the barn if you like." As Samuel jumped into the back of the wagon, the man said, "My name's Anderson." "Thank you, Mr. Anderson, sir. My name's Bush." When they arrived, Anderson showed Samuel into the barn, then disappeared into the farmhouse. A few minutes later, he reappeared with a tin plate of stew and a cup of water. Samuel thanked his benefactor inhaled the food, and curled up on the hay and fell asleep. The sharp barking of a dog awoke Samuel. Blinking, he realized the sky was beginning to gray with the early light of dawn. Then he heard voices. Unsure what was happening, he jumped up, grabbed his shoes, and was about to flee when a large man threw open the door. Samuel dashed to a window and jumped out. "Over here!" he heard someone yell just a few feet away. Suddenly 2 men grabbed him. "We got the rapist," one of them hollered, then said to Samuel, "We're not going to string you up here, boy. We're sending you on to Decatur where you'll be dealt with right proper. You'll get everything coming to you." What happened was he was taken to the Decatur jail. The white leaders from this little town, Mount Zion, where the alleged rape had happened, that night came into Decatur, which had a whole bunch of white folks just standing around waiting for a lynching to happen. They broke into the jail, hauled him out, and lynched him. And actually I have a blog post on Samuel Bush on my blog as a part of the remembering the people who have been lynched, the African Americans who have been unjustly killed. And one of his descendants saw that and wrote to me and just said, you know, that there never was accountability for the case. In the book, Willie is on the County Board of Supervisors, which is almost all white. There's one African American, his name was Hugh Singleton, who was also on the County Board of Supervisors. The African American community in Decatur was very well organized and had elected African Americans to the Board of Supervisors for about 2 or 3 decades. And Hugh Singleton, I think, probably would have liked to have had an ally on the board, but he didn't. And I try to play out in the book how Willie dealt with this in a way where he just simply didn't take a stand, because I think that was what happened in my own family history. And so for Jessica, the question becomes, if I've identified a bystander to a racial injustice in my own family history, does that mean I'm inheriting bystanderism? Or does that mean that I can now, seeing that, do something differently? And so that's where she's sort of grappling with, what do I do with this legacy that I'm aware of now, that I wasn't aware of before? So the story kind of moves along. Another part of the storyline in the present is that the other 5th grade teacher in her school, Esteban, has been working with a group of Mexican American teachers in this fictional school district to organize a Rasa Studies curriculum for the school district. And at first Jessica has no clue why you would do that, but she starts at least listening to Esteban and realizing that it may have something to do with engaging kids like the ones who she's trying to teach. So she gradually becomes more interested in at least what the Mexican American teachers are doing. And so their proposal for ethnic studies goes before the school board. And so here we have February 2013, the school board meeting where they vote on the ethnic studies proposal. Jessica attends the meeting. At first she wasn't going to, and then one of the Mexican American parents of her, that she's gotten to know, of her own kids, is sort of like, well, you're going to be there, aren't you? And she, well, yeah, okay, I will be there. So Jessica quietly opened the door to the boardroom. The meeting had already begun and the room was packed. She slid on in, then along the back wall until she could stand comfortably. At the front, a tall white woman was reading from notes in her hand. And this would simply cause more segregation than we already had. My 9th grade son enjoys hearing views of some of his Mexican classmates, but if they start taking different classes, he would have less exposure to them. As a mother, I don't think that would be good for his education. And as a citizen, I don't think it would be good for any of our children. So I hope the board votes no. She looked nervously over her reading glasses, then walked stiffly back to her seat at the back of the room. Jessica recognized the procedure for board meetings, having attended a couple before. They typically began with time for public comment. Those who wished to address the board signed a roster before the meeting began and were allotted up to 2 minutes in the sign-in order. Although the board had invited discussion when the Rasa Studies proposal was introduced in November, since they'd be voting on it tonight, opinions were strongly divided and the roster was long. Jessica scanned the crowd while a girl who appeared to be a Mexican-American high school student stood and walked confidently to the front of the room. I'm going to skip her scanning the crowd because there are people who, unless you read the book, you wouldn't know who they were. But she's sort of looking around. And that's why we're counting on you to vote in favor of the proposal. The girl finished, silver earrings dancing playfully. Applause erupted from the group of high school students. About half of whom appeared to be Mexican-American. Go girl, one yelled. The gavel rapped sharply. Only signed-in speakers have the floor. Everyone else is to remain silent. Board President Darren Armstrong reprimanded. Jessica thought he looked kind of like Santa Claus, minus the red suit. But the expression on his face was anything but jolly. Oh, Mr. Walsh, you're next, he read from the speaker's roster. A wiry man in his 40s, thinning red hair, red mustache, and silver wire-rimmed glasses, approached the front of the room. Jessica recognized him as a sociology professor from the local university. As usual, he wore a plaid shirt, jeans, and boots. Thank you. His soft voice barely reached the back of the room. Speak up, please, someone shouted. Shh, someone else admonished. The room fell quiet as the crowd struggled to hear. Thank you, he repeated with more volume. I've heard objections that this proposal will segregate the students by race. I want to point out two things wrong with this objection. One is that anyone can sign up for a Rasa Studies class. Our university Mexican-American history classes, for example, draw students from all ethnic groups rather than segregating them. The other thing is that the students are already segregated, but by housing. We all know which neighborhoods are predominantly white and which aren't. This proposal doesn't cause that segregation, though it might reflect it, since I don't think the proposal targets the white schools. But I just want you to stop and think about the fact that we already have segregation, and if we're concerned about eliminating it, we'd be talking about how to integrate housing. Mr. Walsh walked back to his seat with a few light smatters of applause. The next half hour continued in a similar vein. The public comment period finally ended, and Mr. Armstrong moved on to the next item on the agenda. Jessica's mind wandered while the chair of the Budget and Finance Committee droned through a short report in the language of number speak. Then the board went on to consider a proposal for a minor alteration to the district suspension policy. Jessica glanced at her watch. It was almost 8:30 already, and her feet were complaining. Apparently other people's feet were doing the same, since those along the wall were beginning to sway back and forth as they shifted from one foot to another. Let's move on to the next item, the proposal for Mexican-American studies in several of our schools, Mr. Armstrong finally said. We've had this proposal before us for 2 months now. I think we've had ample time to consider it, and we've certainly had ample input into our thinking. He tipped his head toward the audience. Are we ready for a vote? Okay, I'm not going to read you the vote part. You have to read the vote. But I wanted to, kind of go back to look at what we're going to go back in history now. Jessica goes home and she starts reading some newspaper articles. She's wound up from the board meeting and she's having a hard time sleeping. So she had collected newspaper articles about what was happening in Decatur, the Decatur, Illinois area around the time of World War I. And so she starts reading newspaper articles. And this one, these are real articles. So this would have been what my ancestors would have also been reading. I found really interesting. It was written by a German-American attorney in Decatur. And the quote that really grabbed me, the German people are looked on as the foreigners, the English as the ancestors. You could substitute any group except English, and that would be an accurate part of our history. And he goes on to try to, this writer, give the German-American perspective on World War I and what Germany was about and what the German-Americans were about. But the German-Americans, the English speakers, persecuted the Germans on a lot of levels and in a lot of ways. These are just small excerpts from newspaper articles drawn from the Decatur newspapers. Warren taught town to stop talking Hun. Hun became an epithet for German. And so the term was thrown around a lot and in very disparaging ways. The German language was under attack. Iowa passed a law outlawing speaking German, even if you're talking on the telephone. So people, especially people who were recent immigrants who weren't fluent yet in English, really had a hard time because could allow it was English only. Become citizens. This one is kind of interesting because at least there was a path for citizenship, which in the U.S. we don't always have a path for citizenship. But there was talk about deporting Germans. Particularly people who had been born in Germany. So to my knowledge, they didn't deport Germans. But my ancestor, Heinrich, would have been one of the ones who would be deported. I mean, he would have been on the list because he was born in Germany. There was concern that the Kaiser in Germany had recruited Germans in the United States to help overthrow the United States, and that they were using the German churches and the German language newspapers as a ways of sending messages from the Kaiser. This is all has later been completely discredited, but that's what people believe. So by the end of the First World War, German had been outlawed in 26 states. 26 states you couldn't even speak German. The German language, which there have been a lot of bilingual bicultural schools starting in Cincinnati in 1840. That was wiped out. The German-American press, the number was halved by the end of the war. Libraries, countless books were destroyed and burned that were written by German authors. The German churches were folded into the English churches. And there was some Germans who were put in a concentration camp in Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia. A lot of people don't know that. So I tried to crawl into what did this feel like to somebody who is actually living there. And so this last scene I'm going to read takes place at the time that the letter was being written that Jessica found. And so this gives the context of the writing of the letter. August 1928. Mary collapsed into the wooden chair in front of the desk and dropped her face into her hands. It had been 3 months since Heinrich had succumbed to a stroke, but she couldn't get used to his absence. Just this morning, as she was waking, she rolled over to put her hand on his chest, as she so often did, before remembering he was gone. He would tell her she shouldn't grieve, because he was now in the arms of Gott Vater, in German for God. But she grieved anyway. Raising her head, she surveyed the empty cubbyholes in the old wooden desk. All their married life, this desk had been a cacophony of bits of paper, newspaper articles, letters, books propped open to this or that quotation to use in a sermon, and notebooks filled with Heinrich's longhand scrawl. Last month, Flora and Ada, two of their daughters, had cleared it out since Mary didn't have the heart to do so. It stood here now in the corner of the living room, an empty monument to his work. Oh, one of the girls should just take it. Mary was convinced that what killed him was having to spend 3 years watching his life's work unravel, like a sweater when a cat runs away with a loose end of the yarn. But really things had started to disintegrate much earlier, with the mounting pressure during the war for churches to dispense with German. Even before the war, there had always been that element that felt threatened by things German. Mary hadn't thought they held much sway, but then look what happens once fear took hold and more English speakers. The German churches had complied to wartime demands. Heinrich, occasionally invited to deliver guest sermons, had done them all in English. She too had complied when hosting meetings of the German Methodist Women's Missionary Society, entirely in English. But somehow that compliance only seemed to confuse things. The English-speaking congregations began to wonder why German churches were still needed if they could do just as well in English. Why not make everything English? Unite the Methodists once and for all. At the time, the German churches replied that their continued growth was evidence of why they were needed. Indeed, the Decatur church boasted a healthy congregation, at least until the middle of the war. But the English remained suspicious that rather than bringing souls to God, preachers like Heinrich were actually bringing them to the Kaiser. Nonsense, really. When people are afraid, they believe all kinds of things they might question in other circumstances. Then the newspapers he read were stopped. After all, the argument went, it was through the German newspapers that the Kaiser delivered orders as part of his grand design to conquer the U.S. Of course, Heinrich could read the English newspapers just as well, but he preferred the German papers simply because they covered more topics of interest to him. The German churches began to close, in some cases through pressure of English neighbors who were offended by anything hinting of Germany, and in other cases because of loss of members who feared that continuing to attend a German church, even if services were conducted in English, would brand them as pro-German and anti-American. The biggest blow came 3 years ago when the St. Louis Conference of the German Methodist Church was simply folded into the English-speaking conferences, and the German churches were shuttered forever. And by the way, it's almost hard now to find information about German Methodist Episcopal churches. You go on Google, you can find a little bit, but it's amazing how much of that history has just been lost. The German preachers could either retire or accept assignment to English congregations. Those Mary knew chose retirement. That was when Heinrich's health began to fail, never to recover. His heart had broken. Wood creaked as the house sighed. Mary wasn't used to being alone, and she suspected she would never stop listening for family noises. She wasn't entirely alone. Flora and Ada, both teachers, still lived with her and would be home later. But having spent her entire life surrounded by family and friends, she was finding the hours to drag by, very slowly indeed, like a lame old man moving haltingly down the sidewalk. Since Heinrich's death, Mary's thoughts moved increasingly to the family of her childhood, particularly her younger sister Annie, who still lived in Burlington. Scrounging through the doors, she found a bit of stationery Flora had missed. Picking up a pen, she began to write. Dearest Anne, I get choked up every time I read that. Part of the pain of my people. But that led to the fictitious letter that launched then the whole book. What I hope that you don't know what Jessica's going to do till you read the book. But what I hope that happens with Jessica and happens with anybody else who reads the book and happens with anybody else who looks into their own family history, regardless of who you are, is that empathy for people who are different from yourself comes out. What I want, especially with this book, is for white people to empathize, to realize struggles that our ancestors have had, which are not exactly the same, and in some cases are quite different from struggles other people have. But to empathize and to learn from those struggles and to learn that we don't have to replicate from the past. If we understand the past, as Bill Ayers put it to me once, we can become authors of a different history, and a history that we would actually like to be told. So that's what the book is about, and I thank you for listening.
We're going to take a couple of questions. We have 3 hands, 3 questions to start off with. So there's 1 question. Are there others? 2, and then 3. Okay. So you want to ask your question, and then we'll respond.
Sure. Can you say a bit more about how you point this term as critical family history? I get the different traditions that you're going into that, but it's just a really, really nice phrasing.
The second question?
And can I respond to the first question? Because otherwise I'll forget what it was. Dale, can you say, repeat the question?
Sure. I just asked if you could say a little bit more about how you coined that term, critical family history.
Oh, okay.
I understand those different traditions that.
Yeah, okay. I had been doing some work with critical race theory, actually, when I initially just sort of came up with the term, because critical race theory, which takes race as a social construction that has a whole lot to do with how this country is constructed, and then tries to delve into the workings of racism. And I found myself asking many of the same questions. In fact, in another article that I published in Race, Ethnicity, and Education, the whole article is using tools of critical race theory, and it's sort of framed around what happens when you put race back into the racism in the context of how an immigrant then became white. But I had also worked with critical theory, which looks more at the reproduction of social class relations. And so you'll see, to some extent in this book, some look at how class played out and how class was constructed. Some of tribal crit theory, which in the current book, the theories aren't there. I mean, they're implicit, but they're not explicit. But some of the academic pieces I've written, it's more doing those, drawing those linkages more explicitly. But I wanted a term to distinguish what I was doing from what I call garden variety garden variety family history, where you flesh out the family tree and that's it. And so I went on Google to see if anybody else using this term. And it's actually, the term itself is being used, I think, in drug and alcohol counseling, where you take a critical family history of somebody. I'm not exactly sure how they use the term, although I once did get invited to speak at a drug and alcohol conference, and then I started talking about this stuff, and the audience was, what? But it's to link it in with examining how power works in its various forms.
Second question?
I was just wondering what area you were from.
What area I'm from?
Yeah, like your extended family. I was wondering if you have kind of an accent.
Oh, well, yeah. I grew up in Medford, Oregon. I taught high school in Seattle. Then I moved to Wisconsin, where I was for 14 and a half years, and that's probably what you did. My partner's from Wisconsin, so maybe that's why the Wisconsin, some of the pronunciation is still there. My grandkids live in Wisconsin, so.
That's it. Just random.
Okay.
And then I was wondering, so for those of us that have maybe a rough sketch of our family tree, how would we go about starting to insert the historical context into that? How, for a novice that's starting to do things like that, what path would you recommend? Or
Yeah, let me go back to one of the slides here. So when I started doing it myself, I took an Excel spreadsheet. I took an Excel spreadsheet, and on the one column I had my family, and it was decade by decade. And I would write for each family unit, because different family units were in different places. For each family unit, I would write down just the data that I had, including where they were. Then I would, for historical context, then I would start looking at just what else was going on, what else was happening, what other events were happening. And some of it would be wars or famines or weather-related things, or just anything that was going on. And then for the social context part, I would ask questions about who else was around, what social relationships did they have, what were the relationships among different groups, if, who was, as I was mentioning earlier, who was excluded, and that got me into looking at some of the laws around racism, particularly, both Jim Crow laws after the Civil War, as well as pre-Civil War laws and regulations. What values and norms were present, what economic, political, and cultural systems were there. And the question about cultural systems kind of was one of the ones that led me into really unpacking the role of the church in the German community, which I hadn't, I mean, that really emerged from the data. It wasn't something that I thought I was going to go in and find. So, yeah, so that was basically what I did. Now, some places in the country have a lot of primary sources that you can find. There, I found, for instance, in the Illinois area, tons of digitized newspapers. But places in the U.S. where there's been war, like particularly the Civil War, I have some ancestors on my mother's side who are from the South, and it's much, much harder to find records. A lot of them have gotten destroyed. I've gone to county courthouses in places where my ancestors lived. There you can look at property records, you can look at wills, and you can also find out more of the larger context just by sort of going there and being there. Like when I went and visited the German church, it had been an abstraction. You know, I've read about it, but actually being there and then meeting some of the people and being in the church, that provided a sense of context that I wouldn't have gotten any other way. So that's basically what I was doing. And decade by decade, family unit by family unit. I spent a lot of time doing this. Then some of the traveling I would do is I would get called places to, you know, can you come and give a talk here? Then I would occasionally look on a map and say, oh, while I'm there, there's a county courthouse I want to visit. Well, rent a car and go do some snooping around.
Thank you.
Other questions? Oh, let me say another thing about the context part. I taught a course about 2 or 3 summers ago at the University of Colorado Boulder on multicultural curriculum, and then I embedded critical family history in the course. I had a very diverse student population, including some international teachers who were like living and working in the U.S. And the context part turned out to be very helpful for some of the teachers who couldn't find very much data about themselves. An example is this one young woman who's from Kenya. And when we started working on the project, I always have people start with what knowledge is in your family, and start there first. Don't start looking at historical records first. Don't start, you know, going someplace else where you think the ancestors. Ask people in your family. And so she called her grandmother in Kenya and interviewed her and wanted to find out more about her grandfather and her grandfather's, and she was just trying to figure out how her grandfather came to be somebody who was so supportive of her when she was a kid. And she went online and couldn't find anything. Actually, now Kenya does have a genealogy search place, but at the time it didn't. So I said, well, what did you learn from your interview with your grandmother? And she said, well, one of the things that she told me that was really puzzling is she talked about him fighting in a war in the 1940s. And I'm sort of thinking, oh, World War II. I didn't know the Kenyans fought. And she said, I didn't either. And I said, well, why don't you go see what you can find about what Kenya was doing during World War II, what war was going on, because if your grandfather was fighting, you may be able to indirectly find out some information. So she did, and it turned out that the British had enlisted the help of the Kenyans to fight against the Italians and Eritreans, and so that's how that war became a part of World War II, and that her grandfather had learned how to drive during the war, and then after the war was over, then he was able to drive, which most Kenyans couldn't. So he was able to get a fairly good paying job as a driver. And then he emphasized to her the importance of her education and helped finance part of her education. And so she said even if she couldn't find exact details about him, looking at the broader context made some pieces fall in place that otherwise she wouldn't have done. I have some other stories like that, but that's, I think, a good one that shows the interplay between the context and understanding the person. Yeah.
I'd still tell a story. Just quickly, I went to a funeral, which was a really sad event. My uncle passed, and his name was Cheryl. And so I met a cousin. You were talking with the family, and she said, I want to talk to you about, your family history. And I was tired because it was on the East Coast, and I'm in California time. So she ended up coming over to the house, and I sat down with her, and she said, your great-great-great-grandfather fought in a colored regiment in the Civil War. And it just blew me away because I consider myself someone who is a fighter. And I think it sort of explains yourself when you look backwards to your ancestors.
Yeah. Yeah. And looking into my ancestors, it's interesting. There are people I don't like. There are other people who I do like. There are people who I would like to model part of myself after, and other people who I'm like, but they're my people. So
this is really timely for me because I've been working on the story. It's been always a myth in my family that my great grandfather was murdered, and when my grandmother was 10, and nobody knows the story. So I actually wound up going into the historical records and got his death certificate, and have been, piecing all of this stuff together, and talking to aunts and uncles and cousins about what it was 1930, and what's this? How did this happen? And then I got the census information and the names of all of the people that were his neighbors. And anyway, this is really cool because and one of the things we've always talked about was that he came from Finland and he changed his name, and there's nobody knows who his family is at all. And so we have this other myth going that he came over as part of the Swedish mafia. And so now I've been reading about what was happening in Finland during World War I at that time that would drive him to run away and change his name, and then who would have followed him to to have him killed. Anyway, so and he was just a farmer. He wasn't,
oh, that's interesting.
But this, this blows my mind.
Oh, okay.
So I'm just gonna take a moment to close this space, like we opened this space, and so, wanna just acknowledge gratitude for this space, and also gratitude for all of your presence here. And also, Christine, thank you so much for encouraging us to continue looking into our own histories, and that all of us, as we're encountering our students, that we encourage our students to also take ethnic studies courses, and ourselves. I invite you tomorrow. Woodland Community College is having its first All People Celebrate Ethnic Studies Today and Tomorrow event. Christine is our keynote speaker, and so we invite you to come tomorrow. On-site registration is between 8 and 8:30. And so again, thank you. And I don't know if there's another class coming, but